Atop a glass palace in London, a boy lives trapped between grim diagnoses and relentless medical protocols. But everything begins to change with the arrival of a new employee who sees what no one else does: humanity behind the paralysis. Small gestures awaken great truths, and shocking revelations about an experiment involving power, profit, and family betrayal. Now a child forgotten by the system must fight for his body, his history, and his freedom. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching us from. Let's continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear. In the highest penthouse of the most imposing building in the Mayfair neighborhood of London lived Peter Henry Almeida Campbell, a 7-year-old boy with sky-colored eyes that seemed to hold an entire ocean of secrets. The triplex penthouse, with its 900 square meters of Italian marble and armored glass, was called the Glass Palace by the staff, not only for its contemporary architecture favoring transparency, but for the coldness that emanated from every perfectly decorated corner. Little Peter spent his days in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair, surrounded by cutting-edge medical technology, imported toys still in their original packaging, and a team of nurses who followed protocols with military precision but rarely looked the boy in the eye. At 7, Peter had already seen specialists from 5 different countries, all confirming the same devastating diagnosis: a degenerative neurological condition that compromised his ability to move, and that, according to the definitive reports, would condemn him to a life of progressive immobility. Another day, another medication, whispered head nurse Veronica, as she prepared a cocktail of drugs in color-coded syringes. It's 7 years of experimental treatment, and Dr. Vance guarantees this new combination will stabilize the spasms. Peter's father, Edward Almeida Campbell, was the founder and CEO of Campbell Pharmaceuticals, a pharmaceutical empire that had grown exponentially in recent years thanks to patents for rare disease medications. Since the passing of his wife, Felicity, during Peter's complicated birth, Edward had plunged into his work with an obsession bordering on self-flagellation. He was rarely home, and when he did appear, it was always carrying boxes of new medical equipment or announcing revolutionary treatments. "Hello, champ," Edward would say during his weekly visits, usually on Sundays between meetings. He'd place his hand on his son's shoulder without actually touching him, as if Peter were a delicate sculpture that might crack under pressure. "I brought you a new Captain Comet costume, the best one there is." And so the relationship remained. Love expressed through expensive gifts, but rarely through true presence. That Monday in March began with the unexpected departure of the housekeeper, Mrs. Carman, who, after 6 years of impeccable service, decided to retire to care for her ailing husband. Edward, who detested changes to his established routine, hastily authorized the temporary hiring of Jane Reynolds, a 40-year-old woman from a working-class neighborhood on the outskirts of London, recommended by a domestic services company. Jane arrived at the Glass Palace wearing a simple T-shirt and jeans, carrying only a small, worn bag. Her face, marked by experience, carried an unusual serenity, even in the face of the intimidating entry process, which included facial recognition, fingerprint verification, and a detailed questionnaire about her medical history. "Were you informed of the rules?" Veronica asked, handing her a grey uniform and a tablet with over 50 pages of procedures. "Nothing moves here without authorization. Nothing is touched without gloves. Nothing is said to the boy without prior approval. You will clean the rooms according to schedule, without altering the arrangement of any object and without directly interacting with the patient." "I understand," Jane replied, with a tranquility that disconcerted the nurse. What Veronica didn't know was that, behind that calm, was a woman who knew pain deeply. Jane had lost her only son Matthew 5 years earlier, a victim of a rare syndrome that public health doctors couldn't diagnose in time. Since then, she had dedicated herself to studying special care, attending lectures as an auditor at university hospitals, and devouring books on physiotherapy and sensory stimulation. In the first week, Jane did exactly what was expected of her. She cleaned in silence, followed protocols strictly, and remained invisible. But unlike the other staff, she observed, she noticed that Peter never received direct sunlight, as the windows were always partially shaded. She realized that despite the numerous toys, none offered significant tactile stimulation. She observed that the boy was fed bland purees, even though there was no record of swallowing difficulties. And most importantly, she noticed that Peter wasn't truly looked at. He was attended to, medicated, sanitized, but not truly seen. In the second week, while cleaning the main bedroom, Jane noticed Peter subtly following her movements. Pretending to organize books, she intentionally dropped a small notepad. She slowly knelt to pick it up and, in that position at the boy's eye level, whispered softly, "Hi, Peter. I'm Jane. I like blue, rain, and stories. What about you?" The boy didn't respond, but his eyes widened slightly. It was probably the first time in years that someone had asked him a simple question, treating him as a child and not as a patient. In the following days, Jane created a subtle routine. While cleaning the room, she left small objects within the boy's reach: a colorful feather, a small metal car with wheels that actually spun, a prism that created rainbows when light passed through it. She never forced interaction, merely provided possibilities. Until one afternoon, while Veronica and the other nurses were watching a video conference with Dr. Vance in another room, Jane placed a paper airplane made from a scientific magazine page on Peter's lap. "My son Matthew loved these," she said, in a tone as casual as if she were talking about the weather. "He used to say that even without being able to fly for real, he could imagine the wind beneath its wings." And then it happened. Peter looked up and gazed directly at her, not through her as he did with everyone else. His lips moved almost imperceptibly, and a sound escaped. "Thank you." It was just a whisper, but to Jane, it sounded like a cry of life amidst the sterile silence of that glass palace, where a child had been converted into a medical protocol. In that moment, she knew that something greater than a simple human connection had occurred. There was hope pulsing in the veins of the boy everyone treated as if he were already lost. And she, who had known the deepest grief, recognized in Peter's gaze the same thing she saw in the mirror every morning: a silent plea for someone to believe that new beginnings were possible. What Jane didn't yet know was that, hidden in the digital vaults of the main office, documents revealed a very different story about Peter's condition, a truth that would shake not only the glass palace, but the entire empire built by Edward Campbell. The next 2 weeks brought a silent revolution to the glass palace. Jane began to notice unusual patterns in Peter's behavior. While the nurses insisted the boy had involuntary spasmodic episodes, she realized that the movements increased in frequency and intensity whenever certain stimuli were present. The aroma of the lemon she used to clean surfaces, the soft music coming from the small radio she carried with her, or the breeze that entered when she accidentally left the window ajar for a few minutes. One detail in particular caught her attention. During the administration of certain medications, especially a clear liquid that came in blue-coated vials, Peter became noticeably more lethargic. His eyes, which had begun to sparkle during discreet interactions with Jane, would cloud over again like windows on a foggy day. This isn't therapeutic sedation, it's containment sedation, Jane thought, recalling the lectures on medical ethics she had attended at King's College Hospital. The idea deeply disturbed her, but she needed more evidence before forming a definitive opinion. One Wednesday afternoon, taking advantage of Nurse Veronica's absence to resolve an emergency with the oxygen supply, Jane was responsible for supervising Peter while he watched a video stimulation session, documentaries about marine animals that, according to protocol, would aid in maintaining visual function. "Peter," she called softly when they were alone, "do you feel your feet?" The boy didn't answer immediately, but his eyes shifted from the video of swimming whales to meet hers. "Sometimes," he replied in a faint voice. "They feel cold." Very cold. Jane felt her heart race. Cold feet meant circulation. Circulation meant potential for movement. Going against all rules, she knelt before the wheelchair and gently touched Peter's right foot through his sock. "Do you feel my hand here?" An almost imperceptible nod. "And if I press like this, does it hurt?" "No," he whispered. "It tickles." In the following days, Jane developed a careful plan. While performing her regular cleaning duties, she implemented what she mentally called Operation Awakening. When the nurses gathered for lunch or during shift changes, she used the precious minutes for small interventions. First, she brought a ball of different textures that she placed in Peter's hands, encouraging him to feel the varied surfaces. Then she introduced breathing exercises disguised as blowing games, using small, colorful pinwheels. Finally, she began discreetly massaging the boy's feet and legs, using techniques she had learned in a free caregiver course. "Does my father know about this?" Peter asked one afternoon, as Jane applied a warm compress to his feet. There was apprehension in his voice, but also a growing curiosity. "About what exactly?" she cautiously replied. "That I'm feeling things." "They say I shouldn't feel anything." The answer hit Jane like a punch. Who tells a child they shouldn't feel? Who convinces a human being that their perception is invalid? In that moment, her initial suspicion turned into certainty. Something profoundly wrong was happening in that house. "Peter, listen carefully," she whispered, looking at the door to ensure they were truly alone. "Your body is yours. Your sensations are real. And I believe in you." A solitary tear ran down the boy's face, the first visible emotion Jane had witnessed in almost a month of working there. Meanwhile, Edward Almeida Campbell continued his frantic routine between board meetings, international conferences, and laboratory visits. In his rare appearances at home, he seemed increasingly distant, lost in spreadsheets and reports until late hours. Jane noticed that he barely looked at his son during his perfunctory visits, preferring to discuss treatments directly with the medical team. Dr. Vance guaranteed that the new protocol is stabilizing the markers, he commented to Veronica, as he signed an authorization for more medications. "Continue with the increased dosage and monitor for any adverse reactions." Jane, pretending to organize cleaning products near the door, mentally registered the doctor's name for future investigation. Dr. Renato Vance, the name frequently appeared in conversations between Edward and the medical team, always associated with experimental protocols and cutting-edge treatments. At night, after her shift, Jane researched everything she could on her old phone about Campbell Pharmaceuticals and its main researchers. She discovered that the company had grown exponentially in the last 7 years, exactly since Peter's birth and Felicity Campbell's passing. The temporal coincidence did not seem accidental. Among Campbell Pharmaceuticals' most successful products was a line called NeuroQuiet, described on the official website as neuronal modulators for rare degenerative conditions. The medications promised symptomatic control without significant side effects and were considered revolutionary in the treatment of spasticity and involuntary movements. One Friday morning, while cleaning the main office during Edward's trip to Washington, D.C. for meetings with the Department of Health and Human Services, Jane found a forgotten folder on the desk. Inside, initial medical reports for Peter dated from his first months of life. To her surprise, the documents described motor development within expected patterns and normal reflexes in upper and lower limbs. Intrigued by the contradiction, she discreetly photographed the pages with her phone. Continuing to clean the office, she found a laptop open and unlocked, a rare security lapse from the always meticulous Edward. Moved by an increasingly strong intuition, she risked checking recent emails. Among hundreds of corporate messages, a specific exchange between Edward and Dr. Vance caught her attention. The subject was Special Protocol PH, Peter Henry's initials. "We need to increase the dose of the muscle inhibitor. The latest tests showed abnormal activity in the leg fibers. You know what this means for the longitudinal study?" Edward's reply was brief and disturbing. "Do what's necessary. No one can question the original diagnosis at this point." Jane felt a chill run down her spine. What longitudinal study was this that involved a child's health? Why couldn't the diagnosis be questioned? The pieces began to fit together, forming a macabre puzzle. That same afternoon, while assisting Peter in his visual therapy session, Jane decided to perform a simple test. Taking advantage of a moment when they were alone, she brought a remote control car that she had bought with her own salary. "Peter, try to press this button when I count to 3, she asked, placing the small controller in the boy's right hand. 1, 2, 3. Peter's index finger moved slowly, pressing the red button. The car moved a few centimeters across the polished floor. I did that?" Peter asked, his eyes wide with astonishment. "Yes, you did," Jane confirmed, holding back the emotion that threatened to overflow. "And you can do much more." Over the next few weeks, she intensified the secret sessions, always during the nurse's or father's absence. Progress was slow but undeniable. Peter could now move his fingers with more precision, feel temperature differences in his feet, and, in a particularly exciting achievement, slightly flex his toes when stimulated. "Jane," Peter called one rainy afternoon, using the nickname only he used, "why does my father think I can't get better?" The simple question carried the weight of years of neglect, disguised as excessive care. Jane hesitated, carefully choosing her words. "Sometimes people believe so much in an idea that it becomes difficult for them to see beyond it," she finally replied. "But we're going to show him what's possible, one small step at a time." That night, while organizing her discoveries and planning the next steps, Jane made a decision that could cost her job and much more. She needed to take Peter to an independent specialist, someone with no ties to Campbell Pharmaceuticals or Dr. Vance, someone who could evaluate the boy with eyes free of prejudice and self-interest. The challenge would be enormous. The mansion's security was rigorous, the nurses vigilant, and the risk of being discovered before gathering conclusive evidence was high. But remembering Peter's gaze when the car moved under his command, that spark of self-discovery and personal power, she knew there was no turning back. Meanwhile, in Campbell Pharmaceuticals' central laboratory, Edward Almeida Campbell observed through a glass wall several patients in states similar to his son's, or were part of what internal documents called Project Quiescence, a study on long-term neurological control that had transformed the company into a world leader in motor disorder treatment. The control group results are promising. "Mr. Campbell," a researcher commented beside him, "if patient Zero's data remains stable for the next few months, we will have international approval to expand the protocol." Edward nodded distractedly, his thoughts wandering to the image of his son in his wheelchair. Patient Zero, the beginning of everything. Jane's plan needed to be meticulous. After weeks of observing the mansion's routine, she identified the ideal moment. Every Wednesday, Veronica and the nursing staff participated in a video conference with Dr. Vance to discuss the protocol advancements. It was the only time of the week Peter was under minimal supervision, usually with a less qualified employee watching him from afar. Jane had contacted Dr. Michael Sterling, a respected neurologist at the London clinic, who had no ties to Campbell Pharmaceuticals. To avoid raising suspicion, she explained the situation generically, mentioning only her concern about a boy who might be incorrectly medicated. The doctor, sympathetic, agreed to evaluate him confidentially. On the chosen Wednesday, the London sky dawned covered in a dense fog, which Jane interpreted as a positive sign. Reduced visibility would aid the operation. While the nurses focused on the meeting room, she entered Peter's bedroom, who was already awake and anxious. "I'm scared." "Jane," he whispered, when he saw her enter with a backpack and clothes that weren't her usual uniform. "It's normal to be afraid of the unknown." "Peter," she replied, helping him put on a sweatshirt and pants she had secretly bought. "But sometimes we need to face that fear to discover the truth. Do you trust me?" The boy nodded affirmatively. In recent months, Jane had become his only real connection to the world beyond medical protocols. The first human being in years to treat him as a person, not a clinical case. With a skill acquired from her nighttime studies on patient transfers, Jane settled Peter into a simpler manual wheelchair she had hidden days earlier in the service area. To avoid the cameras in the main hall, she used the service elevator, which had temporarily reduced monitoring due to maintenance she herself had requested, pretending to be Edward's assistant, normal breathing. Calm expression, she mentally instructed herself as she crossed the underground parking lot. The rideshare driver was already waiting at the agreed spot with a wheelchair-accessible car. Another detail carefully planned by Jane. "Good morning, madam. Is this your nephew?" the driver asked politely. "Yes, we have an appointment at the London clinic," she replied with studied naturalness, as she helped Peter into the vehicle. During the 20-minute journey through London traffic, Peter watched the city through the window with wide-eyed wonder. It was the first time in years he had left the mansion, for anything other than controlled appointments at Campbell Pharmaceuticals laboratories. "Look, Jane, that building seems to touch the sky," he exclaimed, pointing to a skyscraper cutting through the morning fog. Jane smiled, feeling a mix of joy at the boys' genuine discovery and apprehension about the risk they were taking. If her suspicions were wrong, she could be accused of kidnapping. If she was right, well, she would be exposing something potentially much larger and more dangerous than her job as a cleaner. In Dr. Sterling's private office, located in a discreet wing of the hospital, Peter underwent a battery of basic neurological exams. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses, conducted the tests with a combination of professionalism and human warmth that immediately won the boy's trust. "Can you feel this, Peter?" he asked, touching different points on the boy's feet and legs with specific instruments. To everyone's surprise, including Peter himself, the responses were consistently positive. There was sensitivity, there was response, there was life in those limbs, supposedly, compromised by a degenerative neurological condition. "I want to run a few more tests," Dr. Sterling said after the initial evaluation. "We need detailed imaging and some specific blood tests." The following hours were intense. MRI, complete blood analyses, reflex tests, and electromyography, a full investigation that, under normal circumstances, would take weeks to schedule. Dr. Sterling, intrigued by the case and alarmed by the ethical implications of what Jane had shared, mobilized trusted colleagues to prioritize the procedures. While waiting for the preliminary results, Jane and Peter shared a light moment in the hospital cafeteria. It was the boy's first meal outside the house in years, a simple natural sandwich and orange juice that, for him, tasted of freedom. "If I can really move my legs one day," Peter commented between bites, "I want to play football. I watch games on TV when no one's looking." The seemingly simple comment revealed much. The boy had his own dreams and desires, kept alive in secret during years of medicalized confinement. Finally, in the early afternoon, Dr. Sterling met with them in his office. His expression was serious, but his eyes reflected renewed determination. "What I have to say is very serious," he began, arranging several images and reports on the table. "Peter shows no signs of spinal cord injury or congenital neurological degeneration. The MRI shows a structurally intact spinal cord. The blood tests, however, reveal significant levels of two specific substances." He pointed to a colorful graph. "This is a potent muscle relaxant in a dose far above what is therapeutically recommended. And this," he indicated another mark on the graph, "is a controlled sedative that affects proprioception, the ability to feel one's own body in space." Jane felt her heart race. It was the confirmation of her worst suspicions. "What does that mean, Doctor?" Peter asked, surprising both with his understanding of the situation. Dr. Sterling looked directly at the boy, respecting his intelligence and right to the truth. "It means, Peter, that your difficulty moving doesn't come from a natural illness. It comes from the medications you've been receiving. Your muscles are weakened from disuse, but there is no neurological reason why you cannot regain movement with proper physiotherapy and, most importantly, with the suspension of these medications." A heavy silence filled the room. The magnitude of the revelation was devastating. Someone, possibly several people, had deliberately kept Peter in a state of induced paralysis for years. "My father," Peter began, his voice choked. "Does he know about this?" It was the hardest question, one no adult in the room wanted to answer hastily. "We don't have all the information yet, Peter," Jane replied carefully. "But we will find out the complete truth, I promise you." Dr. Sterling, visibly disturbed by the ethical and legal implications of the case, offered his unconditional support. "I will document all of this officially and contact the General Medical Council. But you need to understand the seriousness. We are potentially facing a case of non-consensual medical experimentation on a child. This has serious criminal implications." The word criminal hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jane thought of Edward's pharmaceutical empire, the teams of lawyers at his disposal, the economic and political power he wielded. Exposing this situation would be like challenging a fortress with a wooden sword. Still, looking at Peter, at the mix of shock, hurt, And hope in his eyes, she knew there was no turning back. "What do we do now?" she asked the doctor. "From a medical standpoint, I recommend immediately starting detoxification and intensive physiotherapy. Peter needs to eliminate these substances from his body and begin to rediscover his true body." He paused, weighing his next words. "From a legal and ethical standpoint, you will need irrefutable evidence. Photographs of medications, dosage records, internal documents proving the deliberate administration protocol. Without that, it will be your word against that of a billionaire corporation." The afternoon was advancing rapidly, and Jane knew they needed to return to the mansion before their absence was noticed. With detailed instructions from Dr. Sterling on how to proceed in the coming days and a plan for secret follow-up appointments, they began the journey back. In the car, Peter remained quiet, processing the day's revelations. Only when they sighted the outlines of the building where they lived did he break the silence. "Jane, if what the doctor said is true, why would they do that to me?" The question, in its childish simplicity, contained all the cruelty of the situation. How to explain to a child that he might have been used as a guinea pig in a scientific experiment by those who should protect him? Sometimes, Peter, people make wrong decisions for reasons they think are important. Perhaps your father believed he was doing his best, following the medical guidance he received. It was a diplomatic answer, but Jane could no longer fully believe it. The emails she had seen, the precision of the protocols, the consistency of medication administration, everything suggested a deliberate plan, not a medical misunderstanding. Back at the mansion, they managed to return to Peter's room unnoticed, benefiting from the interval between the medical team's meeting and the nurse's shift change. Jane helped the boy return to his apparent routine, promising that they would continue their secret work with even greater determination. That night, after her official shift, Jane did not go home. Using the excuse of extra organizational work authorized by Edward, who was traveling to Geneva for a pharmaceutical conference, she remained in the mansion and began a systematic search for evidence. In the main office, protected by a password she had memorized by observing Edward type it, she found digital folders organized by year. In the oldest, dated from Peter's birth, there were initial medical reports describing a baby with normal neuromotor development and age-appropriate reflexes. Only 3 months later, the reports began to mention episodes of rigidity and suspected spinal cord involvement. Coincidentally, this was the same period when Campbell Pharmaceuticals had begun research with a new class of neuromuscular modulators. In a specially protected file, she found what appeared to be the beginning of everything, a document titled Project Quiescence Phase 1. The text, full of scientific jargon, described a longitudinal study on pharmacological control of motor disorders in pediatric patients. The first case listed was identified only as Patient PH, to 7 years primary control. With trembling hands, Jane photographed every page, every report, every compromising email. The evidence formed a terrifying mosaic. Peter had been, from the earliest age, patient zero in an undeclared pharmaceutical experiment, conducted by his own father and Dr. Vance. Even more disturbing was a set of financial documents demonstrating how the proven efficacy of the NeuroQuiet line of medications, first tested on Peter, had transformed Campbell Pharmaceuticals from a medium-sized company into a global pharmaceutical giant, multiplying its market value 50-fold in 7 years. Health converted into shares, movements exchanged for millions, a child's body transformed into a living laboratory for the development of drugs that, ironically, promised to improve the quality of life for neurological patients worldwide. As she organized the evidence on a secure drive, Jane heard a noise coming from the hallway. She quickly shut down the computer and pretended to be organizing physical documents when the door opened. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Veronica asked, with evident suspicion in her gaze. "Finishing the organization of physical files as Mr. Campbell requested," Jane replied with the calm she had learned to maintain in tense situations. "I'm almost done." The head nurse hesitated, her eyes scanning the room for signs of intrusion. "Mr. Campbell just called. He returns tomorrow morning, earlier than expected. Make sure everything is impeccable. Jane nodded, feeling the weight of the information. Time was running out. With Edward returning sooner than expected, she would need to act quickly. That same night, after Veronica retired to her room on the lower floor, Jane secretly visited Peter. She found him awake, looking at the illuminated city through the partially open window, a small freedom she had introduced into his routine. "I found things." "Peter," she said, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Things that explain a lot but also raise difficult questions. About my father," he asked, his voice small in the dim light of the room. "Yes, and about Dr. Vance and about the medicines you take." She explained, in simple but honest terms, what she had discovered. That his body was being manipulated by medications. That his supposed condition was, in fact, artificially induced. That there were documents suggesting he was part of an unauthorized study. To her surprise, Peter didn't cry. His eyes, unexpectedly mature for a 7-year-old, reflected a deep understanding that transcended his age, perhaps a result of years observing the world from a position of forced isolation. "I always knew something was wrong," he said after a long silence. "I felt things that told me I shouldn't feel. I dreamed of running even without ever having run." He paused, looking at his own small hands. "What do we do now, Jane?" The question was simple, but the answer would be the beginning of a transformation that would affect not only their lives, but potentially thousands of others. "Tomorrow," Jane replied, holding his hands firmly, "we begin to reclaim your life. And then we make those responsible face the truth they tried to hide." Edward Almeida. Campbell's arrival was announced by the discreet hum of his electric Porsche entering the building's underground garage. Jane, who had slept only a few hours on the service area sofa, awoke to the sound of the elevators activating. Quickly, she rearranged her uniform and prepared for another day of apparent normality. The pharmaceutical magnate entered the penthouse at 7:15 a.m., with the tired look of someone who had crossed continents on executive flights. Without passing through his son's room, he went directly to his office, where Veronica was already waiting for him with the weekly report on the treatment protocol. Jane, pretending to clean the adjacent hallway, managed to catch fragments of the conversation. "Levels are controlled, but I've noticed some episodes of anomalous muscle response," Veronica reported in a clinical tone, "especially after visual stimulation sessions." "Adjust the modulator N dosage according to the table Dr. Vance sent," Edward replied, his voice betraying exhaustion. "We cannot risk variations at this stage. The European Consortium is ready to invest in global expansion, but they need guarantees of continuous efficacy." The mention of a European Consortium and global expansion confirmed Jane's suspicions. Peter's case was not isolated. There were plans to replicate the treatment on an international scale, which meant potentially dozens, hundreds of other children subjected to the same process of induced paralysis. Throughout the morning, she maintained her seemingly normal routine, but every movement was part of a meticulously elaborated plan. In silent coordination with Dr. Sterling, she had prepared a complete dossier: independent medical exams, photographs of the medications with laboratory analyses, copies of internal Campbell Pharmaceuticals documents, and most importantly, records of Peter's physical improvements when certain substances were reduced or eliminated. The crucial moment would come after lunch, when Edward traditionally spent a few minutes with his son before returning to the office for international video conferences. Jane knew she needed to act within this small window of time. At 1:30 p.m., as expected, Edward entered Peter's room. The boy was sitting in his usual wheelchair, but something immediately seemed different. Instead of the vague, distant look he usually presented during his father's visits, his eyes were alert, focused. "Hello, champ," Edward said with his usual formality, placing a wrapped box on the side table. "I brought you something from Geneva, a watch that projects constellations on the ceiling." Peter did not respond immediately, observing his father with a new intensity. Finally, with the firm voice Jane had been helping him recover, he asked, "Father, why do I take medicines that stop me from moving my legs?" The direct, unexpected question hit Edward like an electric shock. His face visibly paled, and for a fleeting moment something akin to panic crossed his eyes. Who told you that?" he stammered, quickly recovering. Your medicines are to treat your condition, Peter. You've always known that. What condition exactly? Jane's voice sounded from the doorway, where she had silently positioned herself. In her hands, a folder of documents. Edward turned abruptly, surprise quickly replaced by irritation. What is the meaning of this? You are not permitted to be here during my private visits. You are right, Jane replied, maintaining surprising calm even with her heart racing. Just as I'm not permitted to question why a perfectly healthy child at birth mysteriously developed a neurological condition that coincided with the launch of your company's NeuroQuiet. A heavy silence fell over the room. Peter looked from Jane to his father, his eyes revealing an understanding far beyond his 7 years. I don't know what you're talking about, Edward finally replied, his voice controlled but tense. And I suggest you leave immediately, before I call security for invasion of privacy and defamation. Jane took a step forward, placing the documents she carried on the table. These are results of independent neurological exams performed by Dr. Michael Sterling. From the London clinic, she explained methodically. They show the absence of any spinal cord injury or degenerative condition. What they do show, however, are alarming levels of muscle relaxants and neurological suppressants, the same basic components of NeuroQuiet medications. Edward did not touch the papers, but his detail-trained gaze immediately recognized the legitimacy of the medical documents. How did you get this? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Did you remove my son from this house without authorization? Yes, Jane replied simply, just as you removed from him the basic right to use his own body. The atmosphere in the room grew increasingly dense. Peter, silent but completely present, observed the confrontation with attentive intensity. You won't call security, Jane continued, because if you do, this same information will be automatically sent to 3 investigative journalists, 2 public prosecutors, and the National Medical Regulatory Authority. It was a partial bluff. She had indeed contacted a trusted journalist recommended by Dr. Sterling, but the material was not yet in the possession of authorities. The risk she was taking was calculated, based on her assessment of Edward's character, a man obsessed with control and reputation. What do you want? Edward asked after a long moment, his tone now cautiously neutral. I want the truth, Jane replied. Peter deserves to know why he was artificially immobilized for 7 years. At this moment, unexpectedly, Peter took the initiative. With a movement that surprised both Jane and Edward, he slowly raised his right arm and removed the blanket covering his legs. Look, Father, he said, and with visible effort, he slightly moved his right foot. A small, trembling but unequivocally voluntary movement. Edward's reaction was visceral. He recoiled a step, bringing his hand to his mouth, his eyes fixed on the small movement that defied 7 years of diagnoses, treatments, and, it now seemed clear, lies. This is impossible, he murmured. No, it's not, Jane retorted. It's what happens when you stop administering paralyzing substances to a healthy child. He has been improving every day since I started missing some doses or replacing them with water. Edward staggered to a nearby chair and collapsed into it, suddenly looking much older. The corporate empire, the relentless billionaire, the respected scientist. All these personas seemed to crumble before the simple sight of his son moving a foot. It wasn't supposed to be like this, he finally said, his voice almost inaudible. The initial protocol was temporary, just to validate the efficacy of the modulators in a controlled case. A controlled case? Jane repeated incredulously. Here's your son, not a laboratory experiment. You don't understand. Edward looked up, and for the first time there was genuine emotion in his eyes, a disturbing mix of guilt, despair, and something akin to supplication. When she left us during childbirth, I was devastated. Peter was all I had left, but every time I looked at him, I only saw her absence. He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to erase a memory. Dr. Vance had developed a promising compound for neuromotor control. We needed a case study for the first clinical phase, in a totally controlled environment. It was only supposed to be for a few months, but the results were extraordinary, he continued after a pause. Company shares skyrocketed. International investors appeared. Suddenly there was so much at stake, billions in market potential, contracts with health systems from dozens of countries. "So you decided to sacrifice your son's childhood for corporate profit," Jane concluded, without trying to hide the contempt in her voice. "No, I mean—" Edward hesitated, clearly struggling with his own internal narrative. Dr. Vance guaranteed there would be no permanent effects, that as soon as the longitudinal study was concluded, we could begin drug weaning and recovery physiotherapy. "When would that be?" Peter intervened, his voice small but firm. "When could I start walking?" The child's direct question seemed to hit Edward more deeply than all of Jane's accusations. He looked at his son, truly looked possibly for the first time in years, and saw not a patient, not a case study, but a child deprived of the most basic pleasures of childhood. I don't know," he finally admitted. "The initial protocol was 5 years. Then we extended it to 10, with the expansion of international clinical trials. The current plan projects the conclusion of the studies in another 7 years," Jane completed, referring to documents she had found. "When Peter would be 14, having lost his entire childhood and early adolescence, unnecessarily immobilized." Edward did not contest the number. His silence was confession enough. "There are others, aren't there?" Jane asked, following her intuition. "Other children like Peter?" The businessman hesitated, but eventually nodded almost imperceptibly. Phase 2 of the study. 20 patients in 3 countries, selected from cases of inconclusive neurological diagnoses. Jane felt a chill run down her spine. The scale of what she was discovering surpassed her worst suspicions. "This needs to stop," she declared firmly. "Today, now." "You don't understand what you're asking," Edward replied, regaining some of his business composure. "We're talking about billions in contracts, stock market shares, thousands of jobs. If this becomes public in the way you suggest, the impact will be the truth," Jane interrupted, "and justice for Peter and for any other child subjected to this protocol." A heavy silence filled the room. The confrontation had reached a delicate impasse. Edward, clearly shaken but still calculating possibilities. Jane, determined but aware of the risks. And Peter, observing the adults decide his future with a mixture of hope and apprehension. It was Peter himself who broke the silence, with a question that penetrated all layers of justifications and explanations. "Father, do you love me?" The question, in its devastating simplicity, hit Edward like no scientific argument or legal threat could. His eyes filled with tears, probably the first in 7 years. "Yes," he replied, his voice breaking. "But I did everything wrong, Peter. Everything completely wrong." That moment marked a subtle but fundamental change. The father finally saw the son. Not as an extension of an experiment, not as a painful memory of felicity, but as a complete person who had been deeply harmed by his decisions. "What happens now?" Edward asked, defeated. "First, all of Peter's medications will be immediately suspended," Jane replied firmly. "Dr. Sterling has already prepared a safe detoxification protocol and intensive physiotherapy." Edward nodded, without arguing. "Second, you will use your power as CEO to immediately stop all similar tests on other children, anywhere in the world, and initiate recovery protocols for all affected." Another affirmative nod, more hesitant this time. "Third," Jane continued, "opening a specific document, you need to understand the extent of the damage caused, not just to Peter, but to public trust, scientific integrity, and the company itself." She showed initial reports that investigative journalists had already begun to produce, based on anonymous denunciations from former Campbell Pharmaceuticals employees. They did not mention Peter specifically, but raised serious questions about the methodology of the NeuroQuiet Line's clinical trials. "This goes beyond the 3 of us in this room," Jane explained. "There are already investigations underway. You can try to suppress everything, use your power and money to silence denunciations. Or you can do the right thing, take responsibility, and focus on repairing the damage." Edward looked long at Peter, then at the evidence scattered on the table, finally at his own hands that had signed orders, approved protocols, built an empire on his own son's suffering. "How could I let this happen?" he murmured, more to himself than to those present. "That's the question you will need to answer publicly," Jane replied. "But before that, you need to answer your son." Edward slowly rose and, for the first time in years, knelt before Peter's wheelchair. Their eyes were at the same level now, father and son without protocols or medications between them. "Peter," he began, his voice trembling but firm, "I made terrible mistakes. I allowed unacceptable things to happen to you because I was lost in my own pain and ambition. I don't expect you to forgive me now, perhaps never, but I promise that from today I will dedicate my life to fixing what is possible." The boy studied his father's face for a long moment, with the premature wisdom of someone who had lived confined among adults and their complex motivations. "I want to walk, Father," he said simply. "I want to feel the sun. I want to have friends. I want to be normal." "You will have all that," Edward promised, tears now streaming freely down his face. "And more, much more." That afternoon, a transformation began that none of those present could fully predict. Edward cancelled all meetings, and for the first time in 7 years, stayed at the mansion for more than a few hours. With Jane as witness and mediator, father and son began to rebuild a relationship that had barely existed. Meanwhile, in Campbell Pharmaceuticals' main office, urgent emails were sent to laboratories on 3 continents, ordering the immediate suspension of Project Quiescence and a review of all associated cases. Dr. Vance, confronted with Edward's decision, reacted first with indignation, then with veiled threats, finally with resignation when he realized that his main ally had changed sides. The press, already sniffing out irregularities in the pharmaceutical giant, received carefully prepared information. Campbell Pharmaceuticals announced a complete ethical review of its research protocols, citing internal concerns about clinical trial methodologies. Edward did not mention Peter specifically, protecting his son's privacy, but took full responsibility for failures in ethical oversight processes. The company's shares plummeted 40% in a single day, wiping out billions in market value. Furious investors demanded explanations. Medical ethics councils from various countries announced investigations, and pharmaceutical competitors eagerly exploited the sudden weakness of the previously untouchable Campbell Pharmaceuticals. But within the mansion high above Mayfair, a much more intimate and significant revolution was occurring. Under Dr. Sterling's guidance, Peter began his process of physical and emotional liberation. The first 72 hours were difficult, with withdrawal symptoms from the medications his body had received for years, but gradually, with Jane's constant support and Edward's newfound presence, the boy began to rediscover sensations, movements, and emotions that had been chemically suppressed. Veronica and the nursing team were dismissed, replaced by professionals recommended by Dr. Sterling without any previous connection to Campbell Pharmaceuticals. The mansion, once aseptic and silent as a laboratory, slowly began to come alive. Open windows let in the breeze and the sound of the city. Music played in the main rooms, and Peter's voice, increasingly strong and confident, echoed through the previously empty corridors. A week after the initial confrontation, Edward found Jane on the balcony, watching Peter during his aquatic physiotherapy session in the indoor pool. "Why did you do all this?" he asked, genuinely curious. "You risked your job, your safety, faced a billionaire corporation, for a child you barely knew." Jane watched the boy, who was now laughing as he tried to kick the water with increasing force, each small movement a victory over years of forced immobility. "Because I recognized in him what I lost," she simply replied. "The chance to see a child grow as he should, free, whole, true." Edward nodded, understanding more than the words conveyed. In that silent moment, an implicit pact formed between them. The past could not be undone, but the future of Peter, of the other affected children, and perhaps of many more, was yet to be written. And it would be written not with chemical protocols or profit projections, but with truth, responsibility, and most importantly, with the love that had been absent for too long. A year after the confrontation that forever transformed the destiny of the Campbell Almeida family, the old Mayfair mansion no longer existed, at least not as the sterile glass palace that once housed medical protocols instead of affection. The physical space remained the same, but its essence had been completely renewed. The previously white and impersonal walls now displayed vibrant colors and drawings made by Peter himself. The windows remained constantly open, allowing the London breeze to circulate freely through the previously hermetically sealed rooms. The state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair had been replaced by a simple walker which, Each week became less necessary. Peter Henry Almeida Campbell, now 8 years old, walked slowly down the main corridor, occasionally leaning on the walls. His steps were still hesitant, but they carried the iron determination of someone who had rediscovered freedom after years of chemical confinement. "Look, Jane," he exclaimed, letting go of the support completely and taking 3 independent steps before regaining his balance against the wall. "I got another one!" Jane smiled broadly, recording the moment in a meticulous diary she had kept since the beginning of the recovery process. Every new movement, every small achievement was carefully documented, no longer as clinical data for a pharmaceutical experiment, but as precious milestones in a child's journey of rebirth. "Amazing, Peter. 3 more steps than yesterday," she celebrated, noting the date and time of the achievement. "Dr. Sterling will be proud when he comes tomorrow." Intensive physiotherapy, combined with the gradual detoxification process supervised by Dr. Michael Sterling, had produced results that many would consider miraculous, but which, in fact, only confirmed the absence of any real neurological condition. With his body finally free from potent muscle relaxants and neurological suppressants, Peter progressively regained control over his movements. Naturally, 7 years of induced immobility had caused significant muscle atrophy and delays in motor development. The first few months involved slow and often painful progress, with daily physiotherapy sessions that often ended in tears of frustration. But with each small victory, the first voluntary movement of his toes, the first moment of sitting balance without support, the first assisted step, the boy's confidence grew exponentially. Edward entered the room carrying a stack of documents. His demeanor had changed drastically over the past year. The workaholic's dark circles had given way to a more rested face, though marked by different lines of concern, no longer about stock prices, but about the consequences of his past choices and the challenges of reconstruction. "Peter, I heard we set a new record today," he asked, placing the papers on the table and opening his arms. The boy smiled and with calculated care took 3 more wobbly steps to reach his father's embrace. A year ago, such a gesture of physical affection would have been unthinkable between them. 3 steps alone, Father. Dr. Sterling said next month we can start practicing in the pool without the vest. Edward lifted his son in his arms, another gesture that would never have occurred before, and gently spun him. "That deserves a celebration. How about we go to the park this weekend? We can take bread for the ducks in the pond." The mention of the park lit up Peter's face. After years confined within the mansion, every outing into the outside world was a precious adventure, a constant rediscovery. Observing the scene, Jane felt that familiar pang in her chest, a mix of joy at the transformation and sadness for the lost years. Her role had changed significantly, from a temporary hired cleaner to a central figure in Peter's recovery and, surprisingly, in Edward's redemption. The Campbell Pharmaceuticals empire had undergone a transformation as profound as its founder's mansion. The partial exposure of Project Quiescence, carefully managed to protect the identity of Peter and the other children involved, triggered an earthquake in the industry. Edward, in a move that shocked the market and shareholders, publicly admitted serious ethical failures in the company's research protocols. He immediately dismissed Dr. Vance and all associated research staff, initiated an independent ethical audit of all ongoing clinical studies, and established a multi-billion-dollar fund to identify and support any patient potentially affected by questionable practices. The company's shares initially plummeted, but the unusual transparency in the pharmaceutical sector, where ethical issues are often resolved with confidential settlements and minimal admissions of responsibility, gradually began to rebuild public trust and, surprisingly, that of certain long-term investors. "The new Ethics Committee guidelines were unanimously approved," Edward commented, showing the documents he had brought. "From now on, every research protocol at Campbell Pharmaceuticals will have independent external oversight, with patient association representatives on the board." "And the other children?" Jane asked, referring to the other study participants who had been located in recent months. 19 of the 20 are already in recovery programs similar to Peter's. We have established specialized centers in London, Toronto and Sydney. The last family is still resistant. They fear legal repercussions and media exposure. Edward sighed deeply. The extent of the damage caused by Project Quiescence continued to unfold, layer by layer. In addition to the 20 children directly involved in Phase 2, internal investigations had uncovered dozens of cases where neurological diagnoses had been optimized to justify the use of neuro-quiet line medications, with potential compromise of patients' mobility. "How are negotiations with the public prosecutor's office going?" Jane asked, keeping her voice low so Peter, now distracted with an interactive book, wouldn't hear. "Complex," Edward answered honestly. "We are fully cooperating, providing all requested documentation. The proposed agreement includes lifetime funding for the treatments of all affected children and a substantial fine, but avoids restrictive penalties that would prevent the ethical restructuring of the company." He paused, looking at his son with a mixture of guilt and determination that had become his characteristic expression. "It's little compared to the damage caused, but it's the path that allows us to do more good going forward. If the company simply goes bankrupt or is broken up, we lose the ability to identify and help all affected." Jane nodded, understanding the pragmatic logic. The last year had been an intensive education for her in the complex balance between justice, reparation, and practical consequences. What began as a simple moral issue, a child being improperly medicated, revealed itself to be an ethical, legal, and social labyrinth of unexpected proportions. "And the Institute?" she asked, switching to a more positive topic. Edward's face visibly brightened. The new Awakening Institute, established with his personal resources and located on a spacious plot in the West End of London, had become his personal redemption project. The pediatric wing construction is almost complete. The first group of professionals is already in training. If all goes well, we start seeing patients in 3 months. The Institute had been conceived as a specialized center for the diagnosis and treatment of childhood neurological conditions, with a particular emphasis on cases of diagnostic error or iatrogenesis, harm caused by medical treatments themselves. In addition to multidisciplinary medical care, it would offer legal support for families in disputes with health plans or pharmaceutical companies, and transparent, ethically supervised research on non-pharmacological therapies for neurological disorders. "And did you accept the position?" Edward asked with a slight smile. Jane hesitated. The offer for her to become the Institute's Director of Patient Relations had been made weeks ago, but she was still carefully considering the radical career change. "I'm still thinking about it," she replied honestly. "It's a big responsibility." "No one understands better than you what these families need," Edward gently insisted. "You saw what others didn't. You questioned what others accepted. You fought when others resigned. It was true, and Jane knew it. Her personal experience with the passing of her son Matthew, due to lack of adequate diagnosis in the public system, combined with the intense year accompanying Peter's recovery and meeting other families in similar situations, had given her a unique perspective, one foot in the patient world and the other in the medical scientific universe she had learned to navigate. "I'll give my final answer next week," she promised. After Peter's first semi-annual evaluation. The mention of the evaluation brought the focus back to the true center of all that transformation. In a few days, Peter would undergo a complete battery of exams to officially document his progress, no longer to feed pharmaceutical research data, but to celebrate his recovery and adjust the next steps of rehabilitation. The day of the evaluation arrived with an exceptionally blue sky over London, one of those rare days when pollution seemed to give the metropolis a reprieve. Peter was excited, not apprehensive as one might expect from someone about to face hours of medical tests. For him, each exam was an opportunity to prove his progress, to confirm that the body that had been returned to him continued to respond better and better. At the Rehabilitation Institute of the London Clinic, where Dr. Sterling had organized the evaluation with a multidisciplinary team, Peter demonstrated achievements that impressed even the most experienced specialists. Weight-bearing on his legs for increasingly longer periods, coordinated, fine motor movements that allowed activities, like drawing and building small structures with blocks. Perfect sitting balance and the ability to stand with minimal support for up to 15 minutes assisted, walking for distances of up to 30. meters without needing a break. The results are remarkable. Dr. Sterling concluded in the final meeting with Edward and Jane, while Peter participated in a playful activity in the adjacent room. Especially considering the extent of muscle atrophy he presented at the beginning of the process. Childhood neuronal plasticity is truly extraordinary. And what about the future? Edward asked, the question that always lingered in his thoughts. Will he be able to have a normal life? The doctor smiled reassuringly. Peter will never have the exact same motor development he would have had if he hadn't gone through this experience, he explained honestly. There will always be some limitations in muscle strength and endurance, and he will probably need maintenance physiotherapy for many years. He paused, looking at the most recent imaging exams. But within these conditions, I see a very promising future. With the continuation of the current treatment, I believe that in another year he will be able to walk independently most of the time, perhaps with occasional cane support for longer distances or moments of fatigue. He will be able to attend regular school, participate in adapted physical activities, and lead a largely autonomous life. The words were like music to Edward and Jane's ears. Normality, that relative but so desired concept, finally seemed within reach. On the way home, with Peter asleep in the back seat after the intense day of activities, Edward broke the contemplative silence. Have you decided about the institute? Jane watched the London skyline through the car window for a few moments before answering. I accept, she finally said, but with one condition. Which one? Edward asked, genuinely curious. That the institute does not bear only your name or Campbell Pharmaceuticals, that it also be dedicated to the memory of all children who spent years without a correct diagnosis or under inadequate treatments. Edward nodded slowly, understanding the breadth of the request. Fair, very fair. 3 months later, under a white canopy protecting guests from the strong London spring sun, the inauguration ceremony of the New Awakening Institute took place. The bronze plaque at the entrance bore the inscription, "Dedicated to Matthew Reynolds and to all children whose voices were not heard in time." The name of Jane's son, the boy whose loss had shaped her sensitivity to recognize Peter's silent suffering, now immortalized as a symbol of a commitment to humanized and ethical medicine. The ceremony brought together a diverse group, families of children affected by Project Quiescence, doctors committed to reforming clinical research practices, representatives of the public prosecutor's office responsible for the legal agreements, journalists who had helped expose the questionable practices, and even some former Campbell Pharmaceuticals executives who had chosen to collaborate with the investigations. At the center of it all, Peter Henry Almeida Campbell, now almost 9 years old, surprised everyone when, called for the official photograph, he walked slowly but unassisted to the stage. Using only a light cane for occasional support, he covered the 15 meters to the microphone amidst emotional applause. "My name is Peter," he began, with the clear voice of a child who was rediscovering not only his body but his identity. "Until a year ago, I didn't know I could walk. I didn't know I could feel the ground under my feet or the wind on my face. I didn't know I could choose where to go." He paused, looking at Jane and Edward, who watched him with pride and moist eyes. "I learned that our strength doesn't always come from medicines or machines. Sometimes it comes from people who believe in us, when we don't even believe in ourselves. People who see us when others only see problems." His small hand gripped the cane more firmly, but his posture remained erect, confident. "This institute exists so that all children are truly seen, so that no one else is trapped in a wheelchair unnecessarily, or taking medicines that don't help, so that doctors, parents, and caregivers work together, always remembering that behind every diagnosis there is a person with dreams." The speech, simple but deeply sincere, captured the essence of what the last year had meant for everyone involved, a journey of recognition, of errors, of possibilities, of humanity beyond protocols. In the following years, Peter's story and Edward Almeida Campbell's transformation became a powerful case study in medical ethics, corporate governance, and patient advocacy. The New Awakening Institute expanded to 3 units in the United Kingdom and established partnerships with similar centers in Canada, Australia, and Ireland. Jane Reynolds, the cleaner who became Director of Patient Relations and eventually President of the Institute, became an international reference in advocating for humanized diagnoses and person-centered treatments, not just medical conditions. Her lectures on The Gaze That Transforms inspired a new generation of healthcare professionals to question rigid protocols and seek individualized solutions. Campbell Pharmaceuticals, under restructured leadership after Edwards' voluntary step back from direct management, transformed into an improbable example of transparency in the pharmaceutical sector. The scandal that could have destroyed the company became, ironically, the foundation of a new corporate culture that prioritized external ethical oversight and patient representative participation in all phases of drug development. And Peter? At 15, he walked with only a slight asymmetry in his gait, participated in his school's adapted swimming team, maintained excellent grades, and began to show interest in neuroscience and rehabilitation, areas that, understandably, had shaped his childhood in unexpected ways. One Saturday afternoon, while watching Peter swim freely in the house pool, now very different from the old Glass Palace, Edward found Jane reviewing plans for a new wing of the institute. "Sometimes I still wonder if I deserve all this," he confessed, watching the son he could have lost, the chance to see him grow up like this, free, to rebuild something positive after all I caused. Jane closed the document folder and watched the teenager in the pool for a moment. "It's not about deserving," she finally replied. "It's about choosing to do things differently when we realize our mistakes, to use the privilege of a second chance not just for ourselves, but to transform the lives of others." Their eyes met briefly, two people united by an improbable journey that began with an immobilized child and a temporary employee, and culminated in the liberation not only of a body, but of an entire system that allowed similar abuses. "Hey, you two," Peter called from the pool, interrupting the moment. "Come swim too. The water's perfect." Edward and Jane exchanged knowing smiles before standing up. He, the former pharmaceutical magnate, who had rediscovered his humanity. She, the former cleaner, who had redirected her pain towards collective transformation. Together they headed to the pool to join the teenager who had taught them, in the most unexpected way possible, that no diagnosis is definitive when one has the courage to question the established and the hope to imagine a different path. The London sun cast golden reflections on the water, momentarily creating the illusion of a palace, no longer of cold glass and isolation, but of living water and constant movement. A perfect symbol of the journey they had traveled, from rigidity to fluidity, from protocol to authentic life, from definitive diagnosis to infinite possibility. End of story, dear listeners. We hope the story of Peter, Edward, and Jane has touched your hearts. To continue this journey of inspiring narratives about new beginnings, overcoming challenges, and second chances, we have prepared a special selection of equally moving stories. Find them by clicking the button on the left. If this story of transformation resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like this video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexities of life and the possibilities of new beginnings. Tell us in the comments if you have witnessed or lived a journey of recovery that seemed impossible. We look forward to hearing your own stories of overcoming.